something that really stands out to me like a constant is probably the tragedy that always awaits the corner for women, right? And I don't know if it's because we just live in a world that doesn't protect women or whatever the case you want to be. And, you know, obviously we can start talking about race and who's protected and who's not. But at its core, right, I question, what is it about the tragedy that we're always awaiting, right? Why are we always waiting for the shoe to drop? And something that really comes up to me is it's really just this, it's really what we're sold, right? It's the movies, it's everything that we're sold. And I think about how many women operate their lives around avoiding that tragedy, right? And I think that's very interesting, isn't it? Like, I think it's one of those things where it's like you meet people and, you know, you see the single woman in her kitchen, she's washing her dishes, minding her business, and it's like, oh, she's miserable, right? You see the married woman, it's like, oh, he's really a jerk, or he's really this, or he's really that. And it's like, we're always awaiting tragedy. And I think that for whatever reason, I think because of marketing purposes, because we want to know what is happening in the lives of people, right? The secret lives of those around us, we start to craft narratives that may not actually be all the way true, right? We want to know, hey, is this person really happy, right? Hey, what's really going on the other side of that? You know what I mean? And so I think what happens is we begin to craft narratives that are really problematic. And I think when we start to act out these narratives and we start to project these narratives onto other people, well, it's inevitable that we're going to have a breakdown in friendships, right? Nobody wants to be around someone who's constantly prying into their lives, looking for that tragedy. Guys, and welcome back to the Renaissance Room podcast. In today's episode, I have been thinking so much about friendships. I've been thinking about female friendships specifically and how they played out over the course of my life. And, you know, I was sitting here with my hubby and I'm like, okay, what am I doing in my friendships that it's not getting me the results that I want? And I definitely think your girl can be a little rough around the edges. You know what I mean? Like, I really feel like growing up, like, I just feel like I was just really rough and just kind of raised to be not necessarily rigid, but I definitely feel like it's definitely getting very assertive. And I'm like, what is that? What do you mean by that? And I also think I could be a little assumptive, but I wanted to kind of preface on different life choices more so and how it impacts our friendships. Because I think one thing that I find to be a commonality when it comes to women is that typically we want to hang around people who are like us, you know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I do think for myself, as someone who finds a lot of fulfillment in just the curiosities of life, I really don't have a desire to just solely associate myself with people in my cohort, meaning people who are married, right? Women who are just married and just only being around married women. Like, that's not necessarily my vibe, but it does seem to be as though there is a little bit of clashing between our life choices and the friendships that we have. And I say this because I've been in spaces where you're friends with women who maybe don't like men, right? And I'm not saying that they're lesbians or anything like that, but I'm saying women who are kind of like, you know what, I'm kind of off the man tip. It's not really my vibe. And I don't know if there's an assumption that you're going to make all the conversations about your husband and your married life or whatever the case may be. But I've actually found that a lot of times this can bring about a bit of aversion. I think the other thing is, if you are a married woman and let's say you are a stay-at-home mom, a lot of times women specifically, I feel like will perceive those women as, you know, without interest, without like personal development or whatever the case may be. And they may not prefer to associate themselves with those women. And they may assume that those women have a desire to be career women, right? And so I think one thing that I've kind of found, and something that I think does break down friendship and sisterhood, is that sometimes we have this assumption that somebody wants our life, you know, that like another woman wants our life, and not like in a envious and jealous type of way, but sometimes we just have this inevitable thing where we're in our sister circles, we're in these spaces, and we just feel the need to project onto one another. And I think that really breaks down friendship, that breaks down sisterhood. I think, I don't know. I think there's something that happens when you get over the age of 25 and life kind of becomes about what you do. And you don't typically associate with people who don't do what you don't do and don't have what you don't have. And I can understand that a little bit, but like not really, And I think it's really unfortunate because I definitely think it's this right here that causes like such a huge barrier to our friendships. And I was wondering like why that is. And I think it's genuinely just projection, like you're constantly assuming that someone wants what you have and vice versa. And I think when you come from that mental state and you're coming from that mind frame, that is going to inevitably break down friendships. And that's inevitably going to make developing relationships with people a lot harder. And this can go all across the board, right? If you're a divorced woman, you typically seem, I don't want to say divorced woman, it's like, I'm not going to point out that specifically, but I guess what I'm saying in my overall, second premise to the conversation is I think sometimes we want for other people what we have for ourselves, especially if we are content with what it is that we have, instead of coming to a space or a table and just bringing a collective pot of like goodness. And I also think it's really unfortunate because I do think that sometimes being married, especially as we're living in today's times, and this is one thing I don't really like that nobody really wants to talk about, right? Like, I feel like we have to talk about it now because I feel like people don't really like to talk about how being married and being with a man, like there's so much negative connotation around men and relationships right now. And I mean, obviously given the podcast, given the red pill, given these really, really toxic and harmful communities, I get it. But it's like, you have to understand that like so much of this is just simply social media, right? I mean, looking back from my earlier dating experiences when I was in my early 20s, I can't really say that those men were dogs, right? I mean, they were young men, right? Like those men typically were not looking to settle down. They weren't ready yet. So I feel like me personally, I can't carry bitterness in my heart and hatred for men per se, in certain generalizations, even though I had a lot of things that didn't work out, right? Because I just feel like they weren't ready for that. I think it's even just like a psychological, biological, developmental thing, like I don't even think it was like a Jalen thing or women thing, I just genuinely think that those men were young. They were figuring out themselves. They weren't ready for that, So I don't know. I just feel like I can't carry that bitterness with me and I just won't. But I just think at the end of the day, I feel like we're at this place now where, I don't know, I just kind of feel like if you are with a man, if you're a partner with a man, it just becomes this very negative thing. And obviously you're going to have a lot of people who are going to refute this, right? They're going to be like, girl, nobody cares about your man. Nobody cares about, and not saying that you do, you know what I mean? But it's one of those things where it's like, because we're living in a space and time where to debunk men, to debunk relationships, and to really, and this is the thing too, I guess I'll say this, to debunk men, to debunk relationships, and to really prioritize, I want to say, I'm like losing my train of thought, but to really prioritize conversations around like negative aspects of relationships, right? And negative aspects of men and negative aspects of women. That's the norm right now. Like, I feel like we're totally living in a very conformist space, but I don't want to say that it's something that's new. Like, I think this has always kind of been something that's been a thing. And I think we can obviously blame marketing, propaganda, and even like reality shows. I think it's totally normalized to be in a space where it's like you have drama between the sexes. I mean, you can even take that probably back to the Bible. Okay. Like, I don't know, but I just like that's kind of where we've operated for a very long time now. And so it's like, yeah, it's just very normal to speak negatively about relationships and to think negatively about relationships, right? I think you can actually find a larger and greater community in that space, right? I've watched certain feminist channels, and once these women meet these amazing men, they go through their therapy, all these different things, the content slows down, right? The content is less about forming communities based on these really toxic and harmful ideologies that perpetuate continuous drama between the sexes, right? So it's just like, I think it's really crazy. And I think a lot of times, because of the negative connotations, it's hard for married women to kind of be in certain spaces with single women because people are always looking at you to pinpoint certain things and certain flaws. And I think it really takes away from your joy and your happiness, if I'm being honest. So I think it's easier for a lot of married women to just kind of isolate and find themselves in those similar cohorts. And then I think on the opposite end, like being a single woman, I was a single woman before I was a married woman. A lot of married women will sometimes assume that as a single woman, you are looking for a spouse and that you should be prioritizing a spouse, which I feel like one of the things that I would love to really kind of have a conversation about is like honesty. I made a previous podcast where I just kind of talked about how I think we live in a time today where, first of all, we live in America. So you have illness, you have crime, you have, you have the matrix, you have hierarchies, and you have social benefits, and you have all these different things, right? And I'm not saying social security, I'm talking about social status, all these different things that play a role in a person's development. And so I say that to say that everybody's been dealt a different card, right? And I think that everybody is doing the best that they can with the cards that they've been dealt, and that's not to say that people are miserable. Like, I think to make the assumption that career women are miserable, or to make the assumption that married women are miserable, it's really negative and it's so weak. And I think that that really breaks down sisterhood and friendship as well, because who wants to be friends with someone who's just constantly eyeballing them and, looking for something to say, right? Looking to have something to say instead of genuinely being in spaces where people are happy for you. I think that for a lot of people who say things like, oh, well, career is an accomplishment, I would have to disagree. I mean, I think being someone who is professionally established is pretty huge, because I think that it takes time. I think it takes time. I think that it's a lot of dedication, right? But I also think there's a lot that goes into that as well. And then I think about, being in a healthy relationship. And I would say that that's pretty big. And the reason why, because obviously we just gave this entire thing about not, you're pretty much going against all odds, right? I mean, you have all of this rhetoric that's really negative about relationships, about marriage, and so forth. And so if you were to find that and to cultivate that, I think that that's a pretty big thing. And then I think if you're someone who's newly married, right, that is an accomplishment. That is something that you should celebrate. And so I think what you also have is a lot of people picking apart the accomplishments of others and belittling the accomplishments of others, right? If you've been dating and you've had some terrible experiences and you've been learning from the mistakes that you've made as a woman, and now you've presented yourself in such a way, then you know what I mean? I love Proverbs, not because of necessarily the high pedestalization of the Proverb 31 woman, but because I think it really just speaks to the realism that is like being a wife, right? And I don't think that that takes away from being a career woman, but I just want to speak solely to being a wife, because I think being a wife and being a mother is a very noble thing, and this is another thing that I feel like breaks down sisterhood, and it brings a full circle moment to what I was saying. It's like, everybody wants different things in life. And I think the reason why we struggle in relationships, especially today, right? We have one aesthetic, right? We know that what that aesthetic is. And then the other thing too, I think that kind of brings about this sense of competition and comparison and within our sisterhoods is, I feel like a lot of times women are really pressured to have it all. So you can't help but to inevitably look at someone, right? And you have to make a conscious effort to not compare. But I think you can't help but to look at someone and be like, I want that, or I should have that, as well as all of these other additives in my life. And I think that that's another reason why we really struggle, is because it's like we're constantly in a space where we're vying to have everything. And I just think that it takes a very grounded, very solid, and a very whole holistic individual to be like, listen, I'm really content with where I'm at and I'm grateful for what I have. And, hey, I'm going to work the hand that I've been dealt. Is it the perfect hand? No. Is it, can we sit here and rationalize all the different possibilities, how we taken different choices? Yeah. But like, that's giving why would we ruminate, So I just think that it's really hard to be happy in a life. It's hard to be happy in friendships. It's hard to be happy in a society that is continuously bombarding you with continuously bombarding you with choices. And I think it's also really hard to be happy when people are constantly projecting onto you, and constantly projecting all these different things, right? And so I think it's different. I just think it's very different. I think for me personally, I think another thing that really breaks down sisterhood is probably just the lack of emotional availability and the lack of emotional connection. I feel like vulnerability is not really a thing. I think the more prideful we become in our choices, then that's kind of what it becomes. And I'm not saying we have to trauma bond. I'm not saying we have to sit around and sulk at what didn't happen and vice versa. But I do think that, by just allowing ourselves to be, maybe, like, I'm not saying we should trauma dump, but I do think that we should just not sit around and talk about how things aren't as good as they look. No. Right. But I think it's more so just allowing ourselves to be human. Like, what are you into? What do you like? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like friendship foundationally have like completely pivoted, and I think a large part of that is due to social media. I think a large part of that is due to like semantics, you know what I mean? Like, when everything becomes a standard and you have to have it all, you have to, you know what I mean? Then I think it's harder to kind of have like certain friendships. And I think at the end of the day, I think people typically want to be around people who are into what they're into and they, like what they like and so forth. I actually think we're at this point now where it's coming a little bit more taboo to actually have friends from different, I don't want to say spectrum because I don't want this to be political, right? Because I think I would be using that term politically incorrect. But I do think that like it's no longer a thing, right? And so I think what you have when you have these communities of like-minded individuals is you have pollution, right? You don't really have diversification to say, hey, look, I'm not maybe in this space, but I'm actually happy with my choices and I'm happy with my life. And, we can maybe relate on this level, right? I think that would require a little bit too much effort from us that we don't really like to give to our friendships and to relationships in general, right? Being in America is a survivalist country. So we're working to acquire resources for our security, for the betterment of our life. So I don't really think that we have time to prioritize relationships as much, especially as we get older and we may not have acquired those resources or the opportunities are just simply readily available. So I just think there's a lot of nuance when you start talking about life satisfaction and what makes a person happy and friendships and relationships and all those different things. Like, there's a lot of components because I genuinely just think that everybody is honestly playing the hand that they have been dealt. And I don't think that's literally it, and sometimes I think that's really hard to fathom for a lot of people. And I don't know why. I really don't know why, but I know that, that's the biggest thing. And so I definitely think you should always be someone who's willing to reflect, right? I don't mind criticism. I like to grow. I actually don't want to say the same. So I have to check myself. But I do think that a lot of times, when you try to do some research on this, it's always just like, oh, married women don't like single women. And there's always that. And I think too, when you start to program people to be divided based on their circumstances, right? I mean, that's American society. But when you do that, that inevitably is going to play a role. And I think it's going to take intentionality and a very conscious person to be like, hey, listen, just because I have this or just because I've acquired that doesn't mean that I can't relate to this person on a humanistic level, or maybe we don't have anything in common, or, you know what I mean? Maybe we're not going to be able to talk about the meeting that's coming up this week, right? We're not going to be able to go over notes for the board meeting, right? And maybe you're not going to be able to help me, with this baby stuff. But it's like, at the end of the day, I think there's more than life than just one fragment of our lives. I think there's more to life than just one facet of our lives. And I think that that's really why we are becoming less and less fulfilled, because we're really conditioned to only tailor or we're not even really conditioned. I think that time, honestly, time only allows, right? Unless you're someone who takes risk and you do happen to choose love or whatever, relationships or whatever. But it's like time really only allows for the attention and your focus to be on one facet of your life. Like, I just don't think that time allows for the abundance of a thing, right? And I think that's why, if you are someone who's spiritual, you do believe in God, I do believe in Christ, we do have abundance, but it's only in Christ, right? Because it's like God gives you the grace, right? God, can supply the overflow, right? Like, outside of that, I mean, you can't do it on your own. You're very limited into that. And so I don't know, but I do think that there's a lot of competition that goes on. And I think a big part of that competition is birth, fed, and nurtured through societal critiques, societal normalities, and just a lot of negative stuff. A lot of negative stuff. And then I think too, when we start talking about collegiate studies, right? And it's crazy that I feel like we're still talking about college in this day and age. But I think it's because the people who talk about college are the ones who actually have access to college. And so when they come out and they start critiquing college, I think it kind of falls on deaf ears, if you know what I mean. But we know that college is something that is inaccessible, right? It is truly a privilege to be able to go to college and actually be able to afford your tuition. We talk about be smart, go to college and do something that can actually generate an income for you. But we don't take into account the skills that actually go into being someone who actually can, and the passion, right? That goes into account of being someone who can actually successfully complete a degree within a reasonable time frame, right? There's a lot that really kind of goes into college prep that I think a lot of people underestimate, especially if you are in communities where you're underprivileged and you're undereducated, right? College prep is a real thing. Learning how to take a test is a real thing, right? Learning how to think critically, you know what I mean? And even having the discipline, I think, to, complete your core studies and get out of the general education classes, and you know what I mean. And even if you are someone who has been, you've been privileged enough to have the opportunity to complete some of those general education classes prior to showing up in college, right? So it's a long-term game. It's a very expensive one at that. And so I just don't think that it's something that's accessible for everybody. And a lot of people don't really like to have that conversation. It's not a one and done easy fix. I mean, for myself, being someone who wants to study journalism and wanting to finish up with journalism, but realizing that next year is going to cost me almost $30,000 just to finish up one more year. And people are like, well, study something else and do something else, but there's no passion, there's no, and so I think for the people who can do that and endure, then that's great. But I just think that a lot of times it's just not something that's very realistic. And so I think to base education solely on college is also a big hindrance. But I think that this is what happens when, again, we're in rooms with people who think like us. We don't really consider other people to be educated, and it's okay. It's okay. But I think we're done here. I hope the sound in this wasn't too bad. I mean, it definitely was not giving top tier, and I do apologize, you guys. I really need more time to create and a space to do so. So right now, a lot of transitions, but I hope you guys got something from this podcast episode, and you guys have a great day.